The sterile conference room aboard the Zephyrian flagship Rational Imperative hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology. Holographic displays showed the deteriorating atmospheric readings of Kepler 442b, their homeworld slowly dying, as cosmic radiation stripped away its protective magnetosphere. Premier Velthara stood at the head of the crystalline table, her tall, ethereal form radiating the cold authority that had led her people for 3 decades. "The calculations are clear," she announced to the assembled High Council, her melodic voice carrying the weight of mathematical certainty. "Our evacuation capacity is limited to 63.7% of the planetary population. We have 4 to 7 standard days before atmospheric degradation reaches lethal levels." Silence filled the chamber as the implications settled over the council members around the table. The galaxy's representatives, beings from a dozen different species who had come to oversee the evacuation, processed the stark mathematics of survival. "Counselor," Dexman of the Logical Collective leaned forward, his mechanical body whirring softly. "The selection criteria have been optimized for species survival." "Naturally," Velthara replied, activating a 3-dimensional display that showed population demographics. Priority Alpha, individuals between ages 18 and 45 with verified genetic markers for intelligence, disease resistance, and reproductive viability. Priority Beta, skilled professionals in essential fields, engineers, scientists, medical personnel, agricultural specialists. The hologram shifted, highlighting different segments of the Zephyrian population in varying shades. Green for Priority Alpha, yellow for Priority Beta, and a stark, unforgiving red for the remainder. Priority Gamma comprises the remainder. Velthara continued with clinical detachment. Elderly individuals past reproductive age, those with genetic disorders or chronic illnesses, low-skill workers, and children with developmental disabilities. Logical analysis indicates their evacuation would consume resources better allocated to genetically superior specimens. Captain Elena Rodriguez felt her stomach twist as she watched from the observer section. At 38, she had spent 15 years in Earth's humanitarian fleet, coordinating evacuation operations across the galaxy. She had seen disasters, famines, and wars, but she had never witnessed a civilization methodically abandoning nearly half its population to die. "Premier," she said, rising from her seat despite protocol dictating silence from observers, "with respect, you're talking about leaving behind for billions sentient beings." The council turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to irritation. Velthara's silver eyes fixed on the human with the kind of attention one might give to an interesting but irrelevant specimen. "Captain Rodriguez," the Premier said, her tone patient but firm, "I understand that human emotional responses make it difficult to process logical decisions. However, sentiment cannot override mathematical reality. We have limited evacuation capacity. Logic demands we prioritize those most likely to ensure species survival." "What about expanding evacuation capacity?" Rodriguez pressed. "Earth can provide additional ships, resources, personnel. We could evacuate everyone." A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the alien representatives. Ambassador Clixonara of the Efficiency Confederation made a sound that resembled condescending laughter. "Captain," Velthara replied, "your species' emotional attachments are well documented, but they cloud practical judgment. The resources required to evacuate an additional 4 billion individuals would be enormous. The cost-benefit analysis is clear. Such an expenditure would be inefficient and ultimately wasteful." "Wasteful?" Rodriguez's voice carried an edge that made several aliens shift uncomfortably. "We're talking about living beings with families, hopes, dreams. We're talking about optimization." Velthara interrupted smoothly. "The universe operates on principles of efficiency and survival of the fittest. Emotional attachments to the weak and unfit compromise the survival of the strong and capable. This is simple evolutionary logic." Rodriguez looked around the room at the assembled representatives from advanced civilizations, searching for any sign of moral outrage. Instead, she found only calm acceptance of what they considered rational decision-making. "Your evacuation plan is genocide," she said quietly. "Our evacuation plan is survival," Velthara corrected. "Genocide implies intentional destruction. We are simply allocating limited resources to their highest utility. The unfortunate individuals who cannot be evacuated will serve the greater good by ensuring the survival of superior genetic material. You're abandoning children because they have disabilities. You're leaving behind grandparents who built your civilization. You're condemning billions to death because they don't meet your criteria for genetic fitness. Yes, Velthara replied, without hesitation, because their deaths will ensure the survival of billions more across generations. This is logical. This is necessary. This is evolution in action. The matter-of-fact delivery chilled Rodriguez more than any passionate argument could have. This wasn't cruelty or hatred. It was cold, mathematical indifference to suffering. The human delegation will be permitted to observe the evacuation process, Velthara continued. Turning back to her holographic displays, however, we must insist that emotional reactions not interfere with operational efficiency. The evacuation begins tomorrow. As the council session ended and the various representatives filed out, Rodriguez remained in her seat, staring at the holographic display that reduced billions of lives to colored dots. Ambassador Clixonara paused beside her. His insectoid features ranged in what she suspected was meant to be a sympathetic expression. Captain Rodriguez, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that human ears weren't designed to process. I understand this is difficult for your species to comprehend. Humans are notorious for allowing emotional attachments to override logical analysis. But consider, the Zephyrians are making the only rational choice available to them. The only choice they're willing to consider, Rodriguez corrected, the only choice that serves the greater good. Surely you can see that saving 60% of a population is preferable to risking all of them. In an inefficient rescue attempt, Rodriguez turned to face the alien diplomat fully, in human terms. What you just described isn't the greater good, it's the greater evil. Clixonara's antenna twitched with what she recognized as confusion. I do not understand. How can maximum efficiency be considered evil? Because efficiency without compassion isn't civilization, it's just sophisticated barbarity. As Rodriguez left the conference room, she activated her personal communicator. The emergency authorization code she was about to use would end her career and possibly start a diplomatic incident. But some things mattered more than protocol. Rodriguez to Earth Command, Priority Alpha Authorization. I need to speak with Admiral Chen immediately. The communication delay between Kepler 440b and Earth Command meant that Rodriguez spent 18 agonizing minutes staring at static before Admiral Chen's weathered face appeared on her screen. At 63, Chen had spent for decades in Earth's military, rising through the ranks during humanity's expansion into the galaxy. His expression suggested he already knew this conversation would complicate his life significantly. Captain Rodriguez, he said without preamble, I've been monitoring your situation reports from the Zephyrian evacuation. I assume this priority alpha call means our observers have been compromised. No, sir. The observers are safe. The Zephyrians are abandoning 40% of their population to die, and I'm requesting permission to initiate a humanitarian rescue operation. Chen's expression didn't change, but Rodriguez caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated intense thought. Explain. Rodriguez outlined the Zephyrian evacuation plan, the selection criteria, and the fate awaiting the 4 billion beings deemed unfit for rescue. As she spoke, she watched Chan's face grow progressively grimmer. Jesus Christ, he muttered when she finished. They're just leaving them? Yes, sir. Premier Velthara made it clear. That emotional attachment to the unfit would compromise the survival of the superior genetic material. She called it logical evolution in action, and the other galactic representatives, they think it's perfectly reasonable, efficient, some kind of advanced thinking that we humans are too emotional to understand. Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Rodriguez could see him working through the implications. Any unauthorized rescue operation would violate Earth's carefully negotiated treaties. With the Galactic Alliance, it would strain diplomatic relationships that had taken decades to build. It would cost enormous resources that Earth couldn't afford to spend. Captain, he said finally, you understand what you're asking. We're talking about violating galactic sovereignty, potentially triggering a diplomatic crisis and spending resources equivalent to our entire annual humanitarian budget, all to save aliens who their own species has deemed expendable. Yes, sir. The political ramifications alone, sir, Rodriguez interrupted with respect. There are 4 billion sentient beings about to die because their own people think they're not worth saving. If we don't act, we're complicit in the largest act of genocide in galactic history. Chen stared at her through the static-filled transmission, and Rodriguez could see him weighing duty against conscience, protocol against morality. She held her breath, knowing that the next words out of his mouth would determine the fate of billions. Understood, Captain. I'm authorizing a large-scale training exercise in the Kepler 440 system. Multiple fleet elements will be conducting evacuation drills and humanitarian response scenarios. Naturally, if any non-human personnel require assistance during these exercises, will be obligated to render aid under galactic maritime law. Rodriguez felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You understand that this exercise will need to achieve impossible results with inadequate resources in a time frame that defies physics. We're talking about evacuating for billion beings with whatever ships we can scrape together, all before that planet becomes uninhabitable. I understand, sir. Good. Because if this goes wrong, if we lose ships, if people die, if we trigger a diplomatic incident, it'll be on both our heads. But Rodriguez? Yes, sir? Make sure every last one of those beings gets off that rock. No one gets left behind. That's humanity's promise. As the transmission ended, Rodriguez allowed herself a moment of hope. In 18 hours, the largest humanitarian rescue operation in galactic history would begin. And for the first time since she'd heard Velthara's cold calculations, she believed that 4 billion lives might actually be saved. Now she just had to figure out how to fit the equivalent of Earth's entire population into a fleet that wasn't designed for mass evacuation. Simple. The sight that greeted Captain Rodriguez when she emerged from her quarters the following morning defied belief. Through the viewports of the human observer ship Compassion, she could see the Zephyrian evacuation fleet preparing for departure. Elegant vessels designed for efficiency and comfort, their hulls gleaming with the sterile beauty of advanced technology. But what caught her attention wasn't the alien ships. It was the massive convoy of human vessels that had somehow materialized in the system overnight. Captain, her communications officer called out, barely able to contain his excitement. I'm reading 237 human ships on sensors. Everything from military transports to converted cargo haulers to, is that a cruise liner? Rodriguez activated her personal display, scanning the incredible armada that Earth had somehow assembled. In less than 24 hours, her eyes widened as she recognized vessel types that had no business being in a disaster zone. That's the paradise found, she breathed, identifying the massive civilian cruise ship. Passenger capacity, 12,000, and that's the new Shanghai Express, a colony transport. And my God, they've converted grain haulers into passenger vessels. Ma'am, her tactical officer reported, I'm also reading 15 military vessels that were supposed to be in dry dock for maintenance, 6 research ships that have been refitted with life support pods, and what appears to be the entire Pacific Fleet Merchant Marine. The scale of the response was staggering. Earth had essentially emptied its space lanes, pulling every available vessel into service for a rescue mission that officially didn't exist. Rodriguez felt a surge of pride in her species that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. Rodriguez. To all ships, she announced over the emergency command frequency. This is Captain Rodriguez of the Humanitarian Fleet, assuming tactical coordination for Operation. She paused, realizing that their training exercise needed a code name. Operation Nobody Left Behind, came a gruff voice from the Paradise Found. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Acknowledged. Operation Nobody Left Behind is a go. All vessels, begin descent to Kepler 440b. We have 46 days to evacuate 4 billion beings, and we're going to save every last one of them. As the massive human fleet began its descent toward the dying world below, Rodriguez's communications array lit up with an incoming message from the Zephyrian flagship. Premier Velthara's face appeared on her screen, her expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. Captain Rodriguez, she said, her melodic voice carrying an edge of annoyance. Our sensors detect a massive human fleet entering our system. Surely this is not related to our evacuation operations. The selection process has been completed. The unfit populations have been informed of their status. Premier, Rodriguez replied, choosing her words carefully. The human fleet is conducting training exercises in accordance with galactic maritime law. However, if any beings on the surface request assistance, we're obligated to render aid. Assistance? Velthara's silver eyes narrowed. Captain, the individuals remaining on the surface have been deemed unfit for evacuation. They lack the genetic markers for survival and reproduction. Rescuing them would be inefficient. With respect, Premier, efficiency isn't humanity's primary concern. Then what is? Rodriguez looked out at the massive fleet of human ships descending toward a dying world, each vessel crammed with medical equipment, life support systems, and the desperate determination to save lives that others had written off as worthless, making sure nobody gets left behind. The next 6 hours were controlled chaos, as the human fleet established operations on Kepler-442b's surface. What Rodriguez saw when she finally set foot on the dying world nearly broke her heart. The Zephyrians had divided their population with bureaucratic efficiency. The fit individuals, young, healthy, genetically superior, had already been transported to the evacuation ships. What remained were the unfit, elderly Zephyrians whose only crime was living too long, children with disabilities that made them genetically inferior, adults with chronic illnesses that reduced their utility value. They had been gathered in massive camps near the major cities, provided with basic supplies and told to await their fate with dignity. Most sat in quiet resignation, accepting their species' judgment that their lives were worth less than others. Captain Rodriguez called out Dr. Sarah Kim, the chief medical officer from the Paradise Found. "We need to talk." Rodriguez found Dr. Kim standing over a portable medical scanner, her face pale with shock. "What is it?" "I've been running preliminary health assessments on the abandoned population, Captain. Most of these beings aren't dying. They're not genetically inferior. They're just inconvenient." "Explain." "Take this family here." Dr. Kim gestured to a group of elderly Zephyrians. "The grandfather has arthritis and mild heart disease, completely treatable conditions. The grandmother has early-stage vision loss that could be corrected with simple surgery. They were classified as unfit because their medical care would consume resources." Rodriguez felt anger building in her chest. "What about the children? Some have learning disabilities. Others have physical limitations that would require accommodation. None of them are dying. None of them are genetically inferior. They're just different. And their society has decided that different equals disposable. And the others? Low-skilled workers whose jobs could be automated, artists and musicians deemed non-essential. People who protested the evacuation criteria and were reclassified as politically unreliable. Captain, we're not looking at a medical triage situation. We're looking at social engineering on a massive scale." Rodriguez activated her communicator. "All ships, this is Rodriguez, Priority Alpha Authorization. We're not just evacuating the abandoned population. We're evacuating every being who wants to leave this world. No exceptions, no criteria, no selection process. Everyone who wants to live gets a seat on a human ship." "Captain," came a worried voice from the new Shanghai Express, "our capacity calculations will be adjusted." Rodriguez interrupted. "We'll put the beings in spaces designed for one. We'll convert cargo bays. We'll use escape pods if we have to. But nobody, and I mean nobody, gets left behind because we decided they weren't worth saving." Over the following days, the impossible began to happen. Human engineering teams worked around the clock to convert every available space on their ships into passenger accommodation. Cargo holds became dormitories. Conference rooms became nurseries. Even maintenance shafts were fitted with life support for emergency occupancy. The Zephyrian refugees couldn't understand what they were witnessing. Dr. Kim found herself trying to explain human philosophy to a group of elderly aliens who had been told they were worthless. "Your species is different," said an ancient Zephyrian named Kethmiro. His weathered features creased with confusion. "We have been judged unfit by our own people. Why do you risk so much for beings your species has never met?" "Because you're alive," Dr. Kim replied simply. "Because you have value that can't be measured in genetic markers or productivity scores. Because leaving you behind would make us less human." "I do not understand." "Neither do we. Sometimes. But that's what makes us human. We don't abandon people just because the math doesn't add up." The true test came during the second week, when Premier Velthara visited the human evacuation sites. What she saw clearly disturbed her orderly worldview. Humans sharing their rations with alien refugees, converting luxury passenger areas into medical bays, cramming beings into spaces that violated every safety regulation. "This is chaos," she observed to Rodriguez as they toured the Paradise Found. "Your evacuation protocols violate basic efficiency principles. You're compromising the safety of many to accommodate a few. We're saving lives," Rodriguez corrected. "Watching human volunteers help elderly Zephyrians navigate the ship's corridors. Every life we save makes this effort worthwhile." but the resource expenditure is enormous. The cost to your species is irrelevant. Premier, your people abandoned for billion beings because saving them wasn't cost-effective. We're spending more on this rescue than your entire planetary GDP, and we consider it money well spent. Velthara was quiet for a long moment, watching a human child share her toys with a disabled Zephyrian youngling. Your species defies logic. Our species defies your logic. We have logic of our own, which is that every sentient being has inherent worth that can't be calculated in efficiency metrics. That compassion isn't a weakness. It's what makes civilization possible. That leaving people behind doesn't make you strong. It makes you empty. As if to emphasize the point, they passed a medical bay where Dr. Kim was performing surgery on a Zephyrian elder who had been deemed too expensive to treat. Human medical supplies were being used to save an alien life that the victim's own species had considered worthless. We could heal him with 1/10 the resources you're expending. Velthara noted. Then why didn't you? Because he is old. His remaining lifespan is limited. The resources would be better allocated to younger specimens with greater reproductive potential. Dr. Kim, Rodriguez called out, how long is your patient expected to live after this surgery? With proper care, another 20 to 30 years. Easy. And Captain, he's an engineer. He's been helping our teams modify the life support systems. His experience has probably saved a dozen lives already. Rodriguez turned back to Velthara. Your worthless elder has been helping us save lives while his own people wrote him off as a resource drain. That's the difference between efficiency and wisdom. They were interrupted by urgent calls from the ship's communication center. The planetary radiation levels were increasing faster than predicted. They had days, not weeks, before the surface became uninhabitable. All ships, Rodriguez announced over the fleet frequency, were moving to Phase 3. Emergency evacuation protocols are now in effect. I don't care if you have to stack people in the airlocks. Get every last being off this rock. What followed was the most intense 48 hours of Rodriguez's career. Human ships pushed their life support systems beyond all safe parameters. Civilians gave up their quarters to alien refugees. Crew members slept in shifts so that rescued Zephyrians could have places to rest. The Paradise Found took on 3 times its design passenger capacity. The new Shanghai Express converted its entertainment decks into refugee dormitories. Even the military vessels packed aliens into spaces never meant for long-term habitation. Captain, reported the chief engineer of the Paradise Found. We're operating at 300% of safe capacity. Life support is holding, but barely. If anything goes wrong, then we fix it, Rodriguez replied. How many beings are still on the surface? Approximately 50,000. Concentrated in the Northern Continent Shelter Complex, and our remaining evacuation capacity? If we use escape pods, maintenance shafts, and cargo containers with portable life support, maybe 40,000 slots. Rodriguez felt her heart sink. After everything they'd accomplished, they were still going to be 10,000 beings short. Mom, came a voice from the communication station. I'm receiving a transmission from the Zephyrian flagship. Premier Velthara's face appeared on the main screen. But something had changed in her expression. The cold calculation was still there, but it was tempered by something Rodriguez couldn't quite identify. Captain Rodriguez, Velthara said, our sensors indicate you lack sufficient capacity for the remaining surface population. We're aware of the shortfall. Premier, we're working on solutions. I am offering the use of Zephyrian vessels to complete the evacuation. Rodriguez blinked in surprise. Premier, the remaining beings are citizens of our world. If your species is willing to risk so much to save them, perhaps their value was miscalculated. What changed your mind? Velthara was quiet. For a long moment, I'd have been observing your rescue operations. Your species expends enormous resources to save beings you have never met. Beings your own metrics would classify as inferior, beings who offer you nothing in return. This defies all logical frameworks I understand. And yet you achieve the impossible through this defiance. You save lives that could not be saved through logical means. You create value where our calculations found none. I began to suspect that our logic may be incomplete. The joint evacuation that followed was like nothing in galactic history. Human and Zephyrian vessels worked side by side, their crews cooperating to save lives that one species had written off and another had refused to abandon. Elderly aliens, disabled children, and worthless workers were carried to safety by beings who valued them. simply because they were alive. As the last evacuation ship cleared Kepler 442b's atmosphere, Rodriguez watched through her viewport as the planet's surface began to glow with lethal radiation. They had cut it close. Another few hours and the rescue would have been impossible. Final count, reported her communications officer, for 0.3 billion Zephyrians evacuated. 0 casualties among the abandoned population. Impossible, breathed Premier Velthara, who had remained on Rodriguez's bridge to observe the final evacuation. Your species achieved a 100% evacuation rate. Such efficiency has never been recorded in galactic history. We didn't do it for efficiency, Rodriguez replied, watching as Kepler 442b's surface burned with cosmic fire. We did it because it was right. I am beginning to understand the difference. 6 months later, the refugee camps orbiting Earth looked nothing like the sterile efficiency of Zephyrian civilization. They were chaotic, crowded, and utterly human in their organized compassion. Rodriguez walked through the corridors of Refugee Station Alpha, marveling at what they had built. Human architects had designed living spaces that accommodated Zephyrian physiology. Human doctors had established clinics treating conditions that Zephyrian medicine had deemed inefficient to cure. Human teachers were working with Zephyrian educators to develop new approaches to caring for disabled children. Captain Rodriguez called a familiar voice. She turned to see Kethmiro, the elderly Zephyrian engineer, approaching with what she had learned was their species' equivalent of a smile. Kethmiro, she replied warmly, how are you settling in? Better than I dared hope. My granddaughter has begun attending school with human children. The teachers say her learning differences make her uniquely gifted rather than genetically inferior, and your work with the engineering teams, fascinating. Human approaches to problem solving are so chaotic, yet you achieve results that our ordered methods cannot match. I am learning much. Rodriguez nodded, thinking about the broader changes that had rippled through galactic civilization since the rescue. The impossible evacuation had sparked debates across dozens of worlds about the value of efficiency versus compassion, about who deserved to be saved and who had the right to make such decisions. Captain, another voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Premier Velthara approaching, her appearance dramatically different from their first meeting. Gone were the sterile robes of office, replaced by simple clothing more suited to working among refugees. Former Premier, Rodriguez corrected with a smile. She knew that Velthara had resigned her position and requested assignment to the refugee relief efforts. I prefer to be called Velthara now, the former leader replied. Titles seem less important than they once did. What brings you to this section? I wanted to see the children's section, the ones my government deemed genetically inferior. I wanted to understand what we almost lost. They walked together to the education complex where human and Zephyrian children were learning side by side. Rodriguez watched Velthara's reaction as she observed disabled Zephyrian children who were thriving in environments designed to accommodate their differences rather than eliminate them. This child, Velthara said, indicating a young Zephyrian with what humans would recognize as Down syndrome, would have been classified as priority gamma, non-viable genetic material. What do you see now? I see someone drawing pictures that make other children laugh. Someone who remembers everyone's name and asks how they are feeling. Someone who offers comfort when others are sad. Do you still think she's genetically inferior? Velthara watched the child share her art supplies with a human boy who had dropped his crayons. I think our definition of genetic superiority was narrow. They were interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Chen, who had come to inspect the refugee facilities. At his side was Dr. Sarah Kim, whose medical team had become legends among the Zephyrian refugees. Admiral, Rodriguez acknowledged. How are the integration programs proceeding? Better than we hoped, Chen replied. We've received requests from 17 different species to establish similar refugee assistance programs. It seems the galaxy is reconsidering how it handles displaced populations. The cost has been significant, Dr. Kim added, but the returns are extraordinary. These refugees aren't just surviving, they're contributing. We've gained more in scientific knowledge, artistic expression, and cultural diversity than we've spent in resources. More importantly, Velthara said quietly, you've gained something that cannot be measured in economic terms, which is the respect of every sentient being in the galaxy. Before the evacuation, humans were seen as emotional and irrational. Now you are seen as the species that refused to let anyone die alone. Admiral Chen nodded thoughtfully. The political ramifications have been interesting. 6 species have applied for closer alliance with Earth. 3 others have requested assistance in revising their own humanitarian protocols. And the Galactic Council has formally recognized the Kepler-440b evacuation as the new standard for disaster response. Every species is now required to demonstrate that they've exhausted all options. Before abandoning any population, Rodriguez felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The rescue that had started as an unauthorized training exercise had fundamentally changed how the galaxy thought about the value of life. There's something else, Dr. Kim said, pulling up a holographic display. The long-term health data from the evacuated population is fascinating. The beings that Zephyrian science deemed genetically inferior are showing remarkable adaptability to their new environments. Some are actually thriving in ways that their original world never allowed, meaning that genetic diversity isn't a weakness, it's a strength. The Zephyrians were so focused on perfecting their population that they were eliminating the very traits that might have helped them survive future challenges. Velthara stared at the data with growing comprehension. We were not optimizing for survival. We were optimizing for conformity, and conformity, Rodriguez added, is the enemy of adaptation. As the day ended and the refugee station settled into its evening routine, Rodriguez found herself on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Earth hung in the distance, blue and beautiful, and somehow more precious for the knowledge that it had opened its arms to billions of beings who had been abandoned by their own people. Deep thoughts. Admiral Chen joined her at the viewport. I was thinking about efficiency. Rodriguez replied. The Zephyrians were so focused on maximizing efficiency that they forgot what they were trying to be efficient for. And what were they trying to be efficient for? Survival. But survival isn't just about living. It's about maintaining what makes life worth living. Community, compassion, the willingness to sacrifice for others. You think we made the right choice? Rodriguez thought about the 4 billion beings who were alive because humanity had refused to accept that some lives were worth less than others. She thought about the children who were learning that being different wasn't being inferior. She thought about the elderly who were contributing their wisdom instead of being discarded as burdens. Admiral, we spent more on this rescue than any single operation in human history. We violated diplomatic protocols, risked international incidents, and pushed our resources to the breaking point, and it was the most right thing we've ever done. Chen nodded slowly. The galaxy is watching us differently now. How so? Before Kepler-440b, they saw humans as emotional and irrational. Now they see us as the species that defines civilization, not by how efficiently we can eliminate the weak, but by how completely we refuse to abandon them. And what do you think that means for humanity's future? I think, Chen said thoughtfully, that we've accidentally become the galaxy's conscience. Other species will make logical decisions, efficient choices, optimal selections, and when they do, they'll have to ask themselves, what would the humans do? Rodriguez smiled. What would the humans do? Save everyone, even when it's impossible, even when it's inefficient, even when it costs more than we can afford, because that's what makes us human. As the stars wheeled overhead, Rodriguez felt a deep sense of purpose. The galaxy was vast and often cold, filled with species that had learned to calculate the value of life in spreadsheets and databases. But now it also contained a species that refused to let mathematics override morality, that chose compassion over efficiency, that believed every life was worth saving simply because it was a life. The Zephyrians had abandoned their dying world and the beings they deemed unworthy of rescue. Humans had refused to leave anyone behind. In the end, that difference hadn't just saved 4 billion lives. It had reminded the galaxy what civilization was supposed to be. And in a universe where efficiency often masqueraded as wisdom, that reminder was perhaps the most valuable rescue of all. 1 year after the evacuation, the memorial service was held in the orbital gardens above New Geneva. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered to commemorate not the death of Kepler-440b, but the birth of a new understanding about the value of life. Premier Velthara, now simply Velthara, refugee advocate and human ally, spoke to the assembled crowd with words that would be remembered for generations. We gathered here to mourn a world that died, but instead we celebrate the lives that were saved, not through logic or efficiency or optimal resource allocation, but through the simple recognition that every being has worth that cannot be calculated or contained in any database. My people believed that advancement meant leaving behind those who could not keep up. we learned that true advancement means ensuring no one is left behind at all. The humans did not save us because we were worthy. They saved us because we were alive. And in doing so, they taught the galaxy that the most sophisticated calculation of all is knowing that some things matter more than math. Today, 4 billion beings are alive who would have died because their own species deemed them expendable. Children with disabilities are growing up knowing they have value. Elderly beings are sharing their wisdom instead of waiting to die. Artists and dreamers and rebels are contributing to cultures that once saw them as worthless. This is the gift that humanity gave us, not just life, but the understanding that life itself is the gift. So we gather not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was saved. And we promise that never again will any species be forced to choose between the efficient and the right, because the humans have shown us that the most efficient choice of all is refusing to make that choice in the first place. As the memorial service concluded and the representatives returned to their worlds, they carried with them a new understanding of what it meant to be civilized. The galaxy had learned that advancement wasn't about perfecting your population. It was about protecting all of it. And in the vast cosmos, where efficiency had once reigned supreme, there now existed a simple truth that would echo through the stars. No one gets left behind, not on humanity's watch.